Hey everybody, my name is Taylor Gibson, and this is the Gr8Wyte Experience. Hey everybody, welcome to the Gr8Wyte Experience, the show where I talk about anything and everything of interest. My name is Taylor Gibson. Thank you for joining us. Today's episode is one that I've had on the wish list for a while now since I started this show. Now, back in September, you may remember that I did an episode on Nirvana's Nevermind for the 30th anniversary of the album's release. And today is no different as we are once again looking at another album that is one of my favorites that is also turning 30 years old. So joining me for today's episode is an old friend of mine who is a huge metal fan and also is the one person I thought of for this episode when I came up with the idea. Please welcome to the show, Andrew Locke. Andrew, how's it going, my friend? Welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining me, man. And, it's funny because, again, like you and I have been friends for a long time and we've always been, well, I know you've always been huge into metal. I've always been huge into metal. And I'm really excited to get together to today's episode because we've got a influential album that solidified this band as a force in metal, Vulgar Display of Power by Pantera. What can you really say about this album? I mean, it's one of the defining albums of the genre, especially the 1990s where metal was in a weird spot. And the album would go on to be the best-selling album in their discography, going double platinum in the United States and gold in Canada. And the album would go on to be listed as the 1001 albums you must hear before you die, ranked number one on the top 11 metal albums of all time in the 90s by Loudwire, and ranked 10th on Rolling Stone's list of the top 100 greatest metal albums of all time. Now, when talking about the album and the band, Andrew, I think we should talk a little bit about the album and the band as a whole, because honestly, this is an album that for myself personally is so near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure it is for yourself.
Yeah, honestly, it had been a little bit since I'd listened to this album. I've been listening to it since we talked about doing this, and it's like every track you listen to, there's something memorable about it. There's really good guitar hooks at the beginning of I think just about every single song. Yeah, and it's and with the title of like one of the best metal albums as a whole, it's got really good flow from beginning to end. Like each track, it almost feels like each track was intentionally written to be played in that order. And then being the defining Pantera sound, like every album after this would have more hints from this album than say like Cowboys, because Cowboys was like the album before this. From their glam metal days, they shifted into the Cowboy era. And I find this funny, like on the inside liner notes, it says also available. And if you look, like they only list Cowboys. They don't list anything before it.
Amazing.
I love it. And so, yeah, so Cowboys was definitely the big shift for them and just showed that they have something different to play than what everyone else is doing. They brought like that Southern flair to it. And something that I like to call slinky riffs. Like when you think Dimebag Darrell, you think like all these crazy like Southern bluesy metal guitar riffs. Like he was the only one that was really doing that at the time, and a lot of that seeped into a lot of modern guitar player sounds today. But then going to the Vulgar album, it's like everything they changed for the better on Cowboys, they just ramped up on Vulgar, and that was just how do you top that? Like what was the following on this? Far Beyond Driven, I think, was the next one.
Far Beyond Driven was the one that came after that, and they followed that up with The Great Southern Trendkill and
Reinventing the Steel.
Reinventing the Steel, thank you. Which I mean, I think for myself, and as great as Vulgar Display of Power is, I think it's an album that how could the other albums top that, right? And I think that's where I know for some people who go back to listen to the other albums, it's just like they don't really seem to hit that mark. As much as I like Far Beyond Driven myself, it's a very different album than it was from Vulgar, where Vulgar very much was very groove orientated. And while, yeah, Far Beyond Driven had that, but Far Beyond Driven was okay. How much heavier, how much louder can we make this?
Yeah, they do go there, but it's like they had that mentality on this album too. And that's like, they just had like that perfect blend of it. Yeah. And then like Far Beyond had that really weird album cover. It was originally censored, and then they like, you know, they got the one that ended up on the final copy. And then, yeah, there's just so many weird, heavy choices on that album. And they did succeed on that for sure. And then I remember when I got Southern Trendkill, and I was so excited. I put it in, and I don't know, I wasn't big on the vocals for that album. Like, I really like Phil's vocals on just about every other album, but Trendkill not so much. It was just like a little too blood curdling for my liking. Like maybe that was just at the time, it was something I wasn't big into. And then that's also where you had like the big disconnect between the band and Phil. Like I think they did all the tracking for Trendkill at Dime Studio, and then the producer went out to New Orleans to track all of Phil's vocals. So like they were just completely separated. And like there's some great tracks on there too, like Floods. That's the one that comes to mind for me. It's got that awesome bass groove in it. But like overall, there's nothing as memorable on Trendkill as there is on like Vulgar Display of Power.
No, I totally agree with you. And it's funny because I have that in my notes too. And that was another Great Southern Trendkill is an album that, and I'm glad that you brought that up because, yeah, I was also kind of just cold on the album itself. And I don't know, maybe it's because it followed Far Beyond Driven, which I thought was actually a pretty good album in the grand scheme of things. But for myself, it was just, you definitely can tell the discord between the two because I don't know if it's how they wrote the album or how it was produced or whatever, but you can tell there's just that's a weird disconnect between the album and the vocals itself. And I do agree. I don't mind Phil's vocals on it, but yeah, it just doesn't have as many memorable songs. Maybe that is because Phil wasn't really around and he was going on doing his side projects like Down at the time and all that stuff. So I thinking, and of course we talked about the album. Let's talk about our own personal experiences with the band itself. And, you know, Andrew, there's certain bands and there's certain albums that, you know, when you hear it for the first time, you instantly remember where you kind of were. And for myself, Pantera is a band I knew exactly where I was. I was with my dad, who you met a couple of years ago, and he and I were just hanging out one time, and he put on Mouth for War, and I was just sitting there. It was on a mix CD. He put it in, and I just was like, "Whoa, what is this?" Because again, at the time, it was like early 2000s, so like the new metal stuff, rap rock stuff was already big at the time with, you know, the Linkin Parks and Limp Bizkits. And I hear this and I'm like, what the hell is this? This is not anything that I'm hearing on much music or on the radio. And I was really sold on it. And what really sealed it for me, and I also want to bring it up in the notes for the song itself, Phil's build-up scream near the end of the song, and he just launches into it. That's what sold it for me right there. And I was like, whoa, okay, this is awesome.
Yeah, like I remember my very first experience with Pantera in this must have been in like middle school. You know back in middle school when you go and you'd have your computer class, and essentially a majority of the class was just like spent going onto whatever MP3 website and downloading who knows what virus onto the school system.
Oh yeah, totally. You would install LimeWire, give that computer a
yeah, I remember there was one where I think the big one that we saw at my school was like mp3.com or something. It's like, how much more virus ridden could you get?
Right.
And then once we went into, I think it was like grade 9, that was like when YouTube was kind of becoming the more accessible friend for finding things like music. And I think it was, I want to say it's the I'm Broken. No, it's not the I'm Broken video. It's the, it's off of Reinventing the Steel. I should know this. It's it's got like the big whammy riff in it.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're thinking of. I also can't think of the song title right now.
I'm the worst Pantera fan.
Well,
Oh
I
man.
don't know. I mean, there is that one guy in Columbus, but we're not going to go there.
You have a point.
Yeah.
Anyway, what are we talking about? Oh yeah. So I'm pretty sure maybe it was the I'm Broken video. But anyway, so someone was playing it in the class, and I remember just kind of joining in and listening to it. And then after that, me and my friends were at the CD store in town, and they had recommended that I get two albums in particular, and that was the Cowboys album and Judas Priest Painkiller. That was a great purchase. That was a great day for me, man.
Great. Was this the CD store in the mall?
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. Only place I would get CDs for like the longest time.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, Derek worked there for the longest time too, right? So like, I think
Yeah,
that's where like we all knew him either from that or from playing in bands, right?
pretty much.
Shout out to that guy, man. He's great. But
Oh
no,
yeah,
I
he's the
remember,
greatest.
I definitely remember that CD store for sure, man. He gave me some really good recommendations. And it's funny talking about how we got into Pantera. And I remember in the mid 2000s, around the time that you're talking about, I had a guy, my stepdad he was working for my stepdad. He came from Quebec. He was living with us and he asked me, he's like, hey, are you into like metal? As he was like leaving. And I says, yeah, I like metal, whatever. And I remember he gave me a bunch of hardcore albums. Like he gave me not Madball. What the hell did he give me? Hatebreed. He gave me one of Hatebreed's albums. He gave me one of the Megadeth records. But I remember he gave me my Pantera albums. He gave me Vulgar Display of Power. He gave me Far Beyond Driven. And I remember it's just like, whoa, what is that? Like, this is pretty cool. Like, I remember, I think he and I talked about it. I think he had it in his mixed CDs collection. So for myself, that's what really resonates with me. Now, going back to what I was saying about how I first got into it, there was probably a couple of years span where I never really thought about the band itself until the day Dime got murdered. And again, this is another moment that, people who are into music, they could tell you where they were when Elvis died. They could tell you when John Lennon passed away. For metal fans, they can tell you where they were when they found out Dimebag Darrell got murdered.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that one because I got into music after that, or it was right around the time, and I didn't get into Pantera until probably a few years after his passing. So I do remember seeing stuff in magazines about it, so I was kind of aware of it, but I didn't really understand just how big of a metal cultural
Figure.
death that it was. Yeah, like in all of the musician deaths that you hear about, it's got to be like the most heartbreaking one. Like on the plus side, he died doing what he liked, but
Yeah.
It's the worst possible outcome, right? And I do remember, because it's just always been a normal thing for me going to concerts. Like they'd have to pat you down, make sure you weren't bringing anything into the venues. I have to imagine that because of that incident, all that just escalated to a point of being ridiculous.
Well, I know, and I agree with you. Even going to concerts now, and you're right. Even being patted down, it's just a thing that I never thought of. I was like, oh yeah, okay. They want to search for whatever stuff they don't want you to bring in, right? But it's really a shame when you go to a concert and stuff like this happens. And I know in the last couple of years, people could bring up the Ariana Grande thing in Manchester where a bombing happened. But even for metal, when talking about deaths, I do agree with you, Andrew. I do think the Dime passing was one that was so heartbreaking because you didn't see it coming. And I know for metal fans more recently, I don't know. I don't think a death like, say, Joey Jorgensen from Slipknot, heartbreaking for the fans, but it was also one of these things where like Joey Jorgensen wasn't murdered.
Yeah, his was pretty sad nonetheless.
Yeah.
I think he died drinking alone in his house. Yeah, I don't know. I think I heard a little too much about that one.
Yeah, there's a couple of guys, like the couple of guys from the original Slipknot lineup have died, isn't? Like I think Paul Gray's passed away. Yeah, him and
Yeah.
Joey. Very unfortunate. And I think just a side note here about Joey Jorgensen, I had Al Jorgensen's book, the guy from Ministry, and he was talking about when Joey Jorgensen was with Ministry and he had this super high ego because again, he was in Slipknot, he was in this very high ceiling band, and Al basically told him, I don't give a shit who you are and what you've done. You are not in Slipknot right now.
Yeah.
basically like just bitch slapped him back to reality. Not physically, of course, but kind of just a, yeah, hey, check your ego at the door, dude. Like, this is not this band.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Pantera. I think it's only appropriate, Andrew, that we just talk about where metal was in the 1990s. And you and I were talking a little bit about this before we hit record. The 90s were just this weird time for metal. And while the first 2 years of the 90s were fantastic for the genre, I mean, you have defining albums like you had Persistence of Time by Anthrax, Slayer put out Seasons of the Abyss, Metallica put out the Black Album, regardless of what people may want to think about that. And of course, Megadeth put out Rust in Peace. But as the 90s went on, metal just started to form into something that was very divided among the metal fans of, okay, do we like this? Is this good? Because like Pantera, metal in the 90s just took a lot of newer influences. There was a hodgepodge of influences ranging from, well, grunge being the obvious one, but you had the influence of hip hop and goth and electronica. And then a band like Pantera comes along who's so important to the genre because, as you made a great point, as the 90s went on, metal bands started changing their sounds. And you mentioned with Metallica with Load and Reload, Megadeth put out Risk, Slayer, who just put out some pretty forgettable albums in the mid 90s, and then they put out Diablo Sin Musica. And Pantera just didn't compromise on the music itself.
Yeah, I think the only stuff that was kind of in the same realm was the stuff coming out of Europe. Like you had bands like In Flames or At the Gates, and like those bands were really doing like their own version of heavy. And like At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul, one of my favorite albums of all time. And it's kind of it's a heavier album, I would say, than Vulgar, but it's like Vulgar is just heavy in a different way. And being heavy in a different way is what really separates Vulgar from anything else coming out around that time. And like you said, like Metallica's Black Album, like that's the first album I ever bought. And that was my introduction into music as a whole. And it's a phenomenal album. I love it. One of the best drum sounds in all of music. And yeah, just overall one of the best produced albums too. But because of that critical acclaim, there's all like, the whole sellout tag that goes with it. And then it doesn't help that Metallica's following albums were Load and Reload, which were much more commercially viable for people, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, they definitely didn't justify having the Metallica name, metal in a rock band type of thing. They eventually came back to it, but never in the same way that they were in the 80s, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, and then for Pantera there, yeah, they, like you said, they're the only ones that didn't compromise their sound. Like if anything, they just wanted to see how far they could take heavy, like how much further could they push it.
Yeah. Well, and I know even going back to Metallica here, like Load and Reload, I think are just I I don't know. I've heard them years ago, and even for myself, who had no real frame of reference to how, like, I knew how big Metallica was, but even for myself, listening to it, I'm like, who exactly was this intended for? This is just seems it's such a weird album in the Metallica discography, and of course, we're talking about bands in the night who were putting out just kind of, their music just kind of declined. Metallica waited another decade to put out their worst album in Saint Anger.
Yeah.
Which did anybody think Saint Anger was a good idea?
I have to imagine that at least Lars Ulrich did.
I know, right? Like,
Every album that they put out, gets the stamp of approval from Lars at the very least. So yeah, I don't know. It was a really weird time for music on that album as well. Like like the classic what I like to call the Stanger snare, where it's just ping ping ping. Yeah, the
like
Saint
the
Anger
garbage can.
snare. Yeah, exactly. Like that sound, like the pingy snare sound, that was coming from a lot of albums at that time. The lack of guitar solos, that came from albums at that time. It was just, I don't know, it seemed like that they were following trends. Oh yeah, low tune guitars, like that's the only album where they've gone to like what, drop C, and I think there's even a song in drop A. I
I,
can't
th- I
remember.
think I think the entire album is in drop C, if I'm not mistaken. But again, it has been a while since I've actually looked at the tabulature for those songs.
Yeah, I remember there being like one song in particular where it's like the main guitars are tuned down to like drop C, but I think one guitar track is tuned down to drop A for some reason. I don't know. And of course Metallica being their metal side, it's more of like a speed type of thing. Playing so fast in in such a low tuning, it just comes out really the it comes out
Yeah,
really muddy.
it comes out very muddy. It comes out very kind of just very noisy. And certain bands can get away with playing a drop C. System of a Down was a perfect example when they put out Toxicity. Just this great album. It sounds amazing, and all their stuff's in drop C.
Mm-hmm. And they played to those strengths. Like they were a band that kind of when they were writing with that in mind, and they knew how to utilize it. Whereas like I don't think Metallica really knew how to utilize it. It was just more of like a bands are doing this, we'll do it type of thing. But yeah, complete opposite mentality to what Pantera was doing a decade prior, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and even talking about like they were trying to chase trends, even in 2003, you had the new wave of American metal coming out. You had the Lamb of Gods, you had Triviums, you had these bands coming out that were very much. It seems like, and I think more for Lamb of God, I think Pantera really passed them the torch and be like, here you go, take it and run with it, guys.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and like funny you mentioned Lamb of God. Like out of all the new wave of American metal bands that came out, I think Lamb of God is the one that really carries that torch the best. Of course, you know, they have a different size lineup. Instead of just one guitar player, they've got two. But they don't, of course, you know, you can never replace what Pantera had. But Lamb of God does a lot of stuff that made Pantera really heavy. They've got weird riffs, weird southern heavy riffs. They have a vocalist on top of it who can just belt it out too. So they have a lot of Pantera DNA in them, and it really works. And they've really ridden on that for, I'd say, all of their career.
Absolutely. And I know for myself, even like a band like Lamb of God, who I remember when they were first coming out and I was hearing their stuff and I was like, it's pretty good. Like I was not the super biggest Lamb of God fan. I liked what they were doing. I can appreciate what they were doing, but yeah, it just wasn't. I guess the new wave of metal really wasn't for me at the time. Personal choice. But when talking about metal in the 90s, and the one note I want to mention here, the startup of Ozfest, because you've got to realize there wasn't really in North America anyway, there really wasn't a festival. There really wasn't shows dedicated to metal at the time. Ozzy comes along and says, hey, you know what? There's a void here. Start up Ozfest. And the guy, and it's great because Ozzy went on to showcase so many bands that would be big later. Like he brought Slayer, Pantera was on there. Of course, the newer bands like the Cold Chambers and Limp Bizkits and bands like that. He brought them all on tour and says, here you go. You now get to play in front of 250,000 people every night or
Mm-hmm.
whatever they were playing for.
Yeah, like if you look at Europe, they have like, geez, you could keep naming festivals all day long and probably never find an end. Whereas North America, you don't really see that. And then on top of it, Ozfest was a touring festival too. It wasn't like Wacken where it happens at one location one time a year. Ozfest was something that happened at multiple spots throughout North America. And being able to bring a lot of those bands on tour just, you know, finally gave North America something that Europe had. I've never been lucky enough to go to a music festival. I really like the closest thing I've been to is Vancouver Island Metal Festival, which is amazing. It's pretty much just a week of metal bands playing in Victoria, BC. But you know, it's not the same as going to Ozfest or going to Hellfest or going to any of these awesome festivals anywhere else, right? And you know, doesn't look like I'll be going anytime soon with the pandemic, right? But bucket list thing, right?
Oh, I know. Well, even some of those festivals over in Europe, like Wacken, number one, obviously. I mean, but it's funny, even like when I was watching that heavy metal headbangers journey and watching some of those festivals in Europe, you're like, that looks awesome. Why wasn't North America doing something like this? But Ozfest came along and it really just took the torch of where Lollapalooza in the early 90s really had, where Lollapalooza brought out all these alternative bands like from Seattle to the more alternative bands. Ozzy comes along with Ozfest. He says, okay, so we're bringing around these new metal bands. And they're really, and Ozfest lasted. That's what's really surprising. As long as like metal really didn't have that kind of mainstream appeal going into the 2000s, Ozzy just continued going on with it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like I remember being in school and seeing a couple people with Ozfest t-shirts too. Like I think this was like I want to say like 2002 one. It had like the big like the giant demon on it, like jumping off a stage or something. I always remember that when I think of Ozfest, and just feeling so let down that I never got to go. But yeah, and I think even before the pandemic, they were still doing Ozfest. I could be wrong. And then what was it, like around, I want to say around 2008 or so, they were doing like, oh no, maybe it was like 2003 I'm thinking of, where they did like the Black Sabbath reunion shows too, where they actually had the original Sabbath lineup. I've met a couple people who got to go, and they said I've heard some very mixed feelings on it. It was either amazing or Ozzy was way too drunk. But as a whole, like the band apparently always played really well. Having Bill Ward behind the kit, I really wish I got to see that. I got to see Sabbath a couple years ago in Vancouver for their final tour date there, and I was excited. I finally got to see Black Sabbath. Really bummed that it wasn't 4 out of 4. It was, like it's the same three up front, but behind the kit, someone different.
Yeah, it's kind of like if Zeppelin went on a tour without John Bonham, right? Where I know they have their son playing, but it isn't the same. And I think for myself, going back to what you were saying about the Sabbath reunion for the Ozfest, is that you saw a lot of the bands from the 80s brought back their original lineups. Iron Maiden brought back Dickinson, Rob Halford rejoined Judas Priest, and they toured with Ozfest in the early 2000s.
I always forget that was, I guess it would have been Bruce and Adrian, because they both rejoined at the same time. Them rejoining Maiden and Halford rejoining Priest. I always forget that those happened around the same time. And matter of fact, I think they left those bands around the same time as well, like early 90s, and then rejoined like early 2000s.
Yeah.
So bizarre.
So the one final comment, Andrew, I want to make before we head off into our break here is, if you've ever seen pictures of Rob Halford when he was doing a side project Fight in like the mid to late 1990s, where he had like the cut off jorts and the shirtless and no hair, he looks like Phil Anselmo.
Oh yeah, he's sporting the entire Anselmo look. It's hilarious, and it's another great detail just at how influential Pantera was in the metal community. When one of your mainstays, such as Rob Halford, is pretty much jumping into that look.
So, Andrew, we're going to take a really quick break here on the Gr8Wyte Experience, and we will come back to do a track-by-track review of Vulgar Display of Power. Coming right back. All right, we are back. So, Andrew, we had a really great discussion here for the first half of this episode. Now it's time to get into the track-by-track album review. Now, before we get into that, I got to give a couple of album notes. So the album was released on February 25th, 1992. The album was recorded at Pantango Sound Studio in Pantango, Texas. The album was produced and mixed by Terry Date. Now, when talking about metal producers, Andrew, Terry Date's a guy who, for myself personally, I think he gets a little bit underrated in my personal opinion, because you don't really hear too much of Terry Date, which really sucks, because here's some of the albums he did before Vulgar Display of Power. Obviously, he was the producer on Cowboys from Hell, but he was the producer on the first 3 Metal Church albums, Bad Motorfinger by Soundgarden, Apple by Mother Love Bone. Following Vulgar Display of Power, he went on to do Cleansing by Prong, Astro Creep 2000 by White Zombie, and White Pony, just to name a few.
The guy's name is on so many albums. It's kind of impressive. And he doesn't just stick to metal. He goes to rock. He goes to hip hop. He bounces between different genres for sure. And he does a lot of bands that I've listened to for years. And honestly, I had no idea he was even a part of them. Like obviously Pantera, he's part of that. He's done Slayer, Havoc, love Havoc. Then there's like Slipknot, Deftones. Yeah. And Soundgarden. His name is all over the place. Yeah. It's really interesting to see that. And I really didn't know he was on nearly as many albums as he's been a part of. It looks like, if I had to guess, I'd say over 50 albums.
Easy.
That's crazy.
Yeah, because Terry Date isn't really a name that gets brought up as much, especially in the world of rock, where you have the guys like the Rick Rubins and Butch Viggs, guys who made these very, very big name albums. And yet here's Terry Date, who's doing all these big albums, and nobody really seems to give him a lot of credit.
I'm sure people do.
But you don't hear a ton about him though, when compared
to. Like I don't know, when I listen to albums, there's not many where I'll actually be like, oh yeah, this producer. Like for the most part, like I'm looking at bands. When you look at a band, we'll bring up the Metallica example again. When you think of like mid Metallica, like there's early Metallica, mid Metallica, and modern Metallica. It's like that mid Metallica just has Bob Rock all over it, right? So he's kind of synonymous with the Metallica name. And funny enough, like when you look at Terry Date's resume, he was on, I'd say, like every single Pantera album in some form or another. I can't remember if he did Reinventing the Steel or not, but yeah, he did the 20th anniversary edition of it. So he technically has his name on every single Pantera album.
Yeah, because it really isn't a defining trait about Terry Date in any of the records, unlike, say, a Rick Rubin or any of it. And I think for myself, even looking at Ross Robinson in the 2000s when he was doing Slipknot and he was doing all these rap rock new metal bands, you could tell like there was very much a sound that he was going for, very low end, no treble, kind of like it throwing a punch right in the sternum, where Terry just doesn't really seem to have that kind of trait about him. Now, talking about the band at the time, the band consisted of Phil Anselmo on vocals, Diamond Daryl Abbott on guitar. And this is something you and I talked about before we hit record, is that I said that Dime didn't even go by Dimebag on this record at all. He still went by Diamond.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like I think there were people that even, poke fun at him about it too. Like I had no idea until you brought it up that he was still called Diamond Daryl on this album. I thought that was something that stuck around for Cowboys, but didn't go on past it. But yeah, I've got the CD liner notes here. There's a picture of him and it says Diamond Daryl, plain as day. So yeah, just a little detail that I've never known about. That's awesome.
We also had Rex Brown on bass and Vinnie Paul on drums. So to start off, Vulgar Display of Power, the opening track in the album, Mouth for War, that opening riff, 20 years later after I heard it, God, that riff still hits though.
Yeah, it's a fantastic album opener. And think about someone who's buying this record on, without knowing anything about the album. Like you look at the cover, it's got some dude being punched in the face. It's called Vulgar Display of Power. And then you put the CD in, put the record on, and the first thing you hear is this, and it's just pummeling in your face, right? The album aesthetic that they have visually matches what you're hearing in the audio. And that opening track, it really displays what you're going to be hearing for the next 52 minutes. It's just this great mixture of a song. Starts out heavy, goes to like what I like to call those slinky guitar riffs, and it really introduces you to what this Vulgar Display of Power world is going to sound like. When you think back to like classic albums, that album opener, it should be like pretty much the idea of what the whole album is going to sound like, down to one song. And it's like you're never going to open your album with like a ballad, or the closest thing you're going to get is like if you look at Metallica's Master of Puppets, it starts out with like clean guitars, but then it gets super heavy, and it's like that song really tries to show what the rest of the album's going to be. It's got slow, fast, heavy, all those parts that you're going to hear for the rest of the album in that one song. Oh yeah, you go.
No, I totally agree. And even for myself, the one thing I was going to mention with that opening riff, and earlier in this episode, I mentioned Phil Anselmo's side project Down. And at the time, Phil Anselmo was doing or later on in his career, he was doing a lot of side projects like Superjoint Ritual and Down. And there was I think there was a thing that, I don't think it was Vice. I think it was Noisy. They were doing this thing about the New Orleans metal scene, and Phil Anselmo had a big part in this, obviously with Down and
Superjoint Ritual.
Superjoint Ritual, and of course, he had Pepper Keenan with Corrosion of Conformity. And Phil talked about the opening riff of Mouth for War and how Phil actually wrote it. Phil actually wrote the riff, and he gave it to Dime. He's like, "Here, try something like this," and that's what came out on the record.
Yeah, and you know, Dimebag just has the way he plays. I like when I think of Phil, I don't really think guitar. So I was actually really surprised to find out that he actually wrote on guitar. Seeing a lot of backstage or behind the scenes stuff for his like other projects, you see him playing guitar and writing, but it's just visually I never associate the two things. It makes sense if he's got a solo project like Phil Anselmo and the Illegals. Yeah, it makes sense that he's a big part of the writing process for that. He's not just someone to stand around, wait until someone else writes the riff and then join in. It's a solo project. He's going to be all over it. But yeah, even for a band like Pantera, where the guitar is the big main focus of that band, to know that Phil actually came in and added with guitar riffs, it's pretty cool. Yeah, I didn't know that was a thing. It's not the most difficult riff, but it's a memorable riff. And the way that Dime plays it probably just made it even better.
Exactly. And that's where my train of thought, and I think train of thought for a lot of people, is that when it comes to memorable guitar riffs, it doesn't need to be the most complex. It doesn't need to be the most difficult. It's a riff that it comes out. It's very simple, very memorable. Talking about rock, well, Smells Like Teen Spirit. There's a perfect example of a riff that's not hard. It's just 4 chords.
Yeah, even going into the verses, same 4 chords,
just 2 notes.
No guitar. It's just it's crazy. Yeah, and that simplicity factor is all over this album. There's a lot of riffs that sound really easy, but then like we'll get to it in a couple of minutes, but you'll get to Walk, right? And that riff, super easy riff, but to play it the same every single time while you're tracking multiple rhythm tracks, pretty impressive. Like I don't know to what scale there's going to be some cutting and pasting going on with any of the tracks. Like I've heard from I've heard that Pantera never did that, but that technology was around at the time. You look at, we'll bring up the Metallica thing again, and Justice for All. That album, like when you listen to Dyer's Eve, the big double kick part for the verses, technically Lars didn't really play it the entire time. He pretty much just played one good revolution of it, and then they just like copied the tape and taped it together for all the sections that needed it.
Really?
And then like you have I think it's like Shortest Straw on that album. The chorus vocals, James Hetfield only did them once, and then they chopped them up and taped them in place where they were supposed to go. So, you know, the technology or the methods were available at the time to do something like that. But when you listen to Pantera's guitars, it's, I don't know. I don't think they were. When you listen to it, you can hear there's like, it feels like there's like minor differences with it. And it's just enough where you can be like, you know what, this actually feels legit. And that is just part of their sound. He was a super accurate player, and it just blew people away.
Absolutely. Now, another thing that really blew me away, and again, it'll probably be a very consistent theme throughout the album, the rhythm section of Vinnie Paul and Rex Brown. And I want to bring up Rex Brown personally, because I know for yourself, Andrew, being a bass player, I want to get your thoughts on Rex Brown as a bass player, because he's in the world of metal. Metal and rock are not short on great bass players, from Les Claypool to the late Cliff Burton. Where would Rex Brown really rank in that category of all these metal guys? He doesn't seem to get any recognition at all.
Yeah, he does some really great stuff. Like I mentioned Floods earlier, and part of the classic Pantera sound is when it goes to a guitar solo, there's a lot of the time there's no rhythm guitar tracks behind the solo. It is just 3 guys you're hearing drums, you're hearing bass, and you're hearing a guitar solo on top of it. And it feels real. Like when you go and see that band live, that's what it's going to sound like. That said, there are songs on this album where there are backing rhythm tracks. Like I think Mouth for War has has backing rhythms on that for sure. But to that point, it's hard to say because the bass tones overall, like it serves its purpose. It in a very minimal way, in my opinion. As a bass player, I would like to hear more of the bass, but that's not where the focus is on this band. Their focus is on the pummeling drums, on the heavy guitars, but the bass just there to accent. But I really feel like they could have brought up like the clankiness of the bass. Like Rex is a pick player, so to have that extra clank going on with his playing, I think would have really accented it a little more. Maybe some more of that mid EQ, bump that up a little bit just to give it that little more oomph, because that is one of the drawbacks that I find when it does go to the no rhythm guitar solos. It is drastically more quiet, and the bass doesn't really feel like it's taking up that much space. Even if maybe like the response was to bring up the bass just for those isolated sections, I think it would have had a better effect. He's a fantastic player and he does some really cool stuff. Like in Down, he does some cool stuff too. But yeah, he's often the one that's thought of the least, in my opinion, because you have Phil, who's front and center. You have Dimebag, who's front and center, and you've got Vinnie Paul, who's just a madman behind the kit, and he's another front and center guy. So you have three guys taking up so much space in the mix, and then you have Rex, great, but just doesn't quite get that spotlight.
Absolutely. And even going back to your point here, Andrew, where you're talking about when Dime was playing a solo and the bass wasn't mixed very high up to kind of help. I wasn't honestly going to say, would you think, for me personally, I don't know how I think it would be a little bit distracting because you would notice that the bass wasn't mixed very high up, hits the solo, and now it's up here, right? You would definitely tell that it got mixed pretty high up at that point.
It happens very frequently on albums where like it'll sit comfortably like in a mix between a rhythm guitar and a bass guitar, and you don't really notice it. But when it drops out, sometimes they will bring up the bass a little bit just to fill the space, and it's not that noticeable. Like it's kind of like it's almost the equivalent of like I've typically played in 3-piece bands over the years, and being in bands with one guitar player, yeah, when the solo drops out, it kind of lacks something. So I've usually got something on my pedal board like a distortion or some kind of boost where I can at least bring those levels up a little bit to fill some space. So you can get away with that stuff. It's just, I don't know. I don't think they wanted to on these albums.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I want to talk about Dimebag Darrell's playing on this because as much as I thought his playing was really solid on this, the thing that really shines for me, and it's a theme, again, going back, even talking about the rhythm section, that's really a theme in this album, his solo. For me, his solo is what really shines on this song for myself.
It does that classic first track thing where, they really introduce it well. And and it does set the theme for how a lot of these solos are going to be, except for the rhythm guitar lying below it. That's about the only thing that doesn't really set the theme for the rest of the album. I'm trying to remember how the solo goes here.
I think it's like it's like that.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. I just push play and it was really loud.
Way to break kayfabe, Andrew. Way to go. But no, honestly, I thought Dime really was great in this. Now, while you're listening to the solo, I want to talk a little bit about the breakdown at 3 minutes, 7 seconds. I already talked about how 10-year-old me already liked the song, and how that scream sold it for me. But Phil's build-up, though. That's just his build-up, but really that plus how the entire band just speeds up right then and there when it kicks into it. That's what really sold it for me 20 years after the fact.
Vocal performances are fantastic on this album too. Yeah, from front to back, it's great performances from everyone. But I think this was also probably the peak of Phil's sound. Like, sure, on Cowboys he was able to hit that really high falsetto on Cemetery Gates, but he doesn't really do that on any other song, and he definitely doesn't tackle that sound on this album. So yeah, like back to that topic before, yeah, like pretty much every staple sound from Pantera you can trace back to this album in particular. Especially like the grittier vocal style. He goes low for a couple notes, but yeah, he kind of has like that comfortable, like not comfortable. Yeah, he's got like a really high grit to his sound on this album, and yeah, he just pushes a lot of syllables, and you can tell he's so angry while recording it too. I think I saw a thing with Terry Date where he was talking about like, I think the only person to rival the amount of chairs thrown in a studio,
Cornell.
yeah, was Chris Cornell. That was the only one.
Yep.
So great.
And talking about two great singers too, right? You have Phil that has a really high end guttural sound, and of course Cornell is Chris Cornell. Any way you want to slice it, right?
Oh yeah, Chris was one of the best vocalists ever.
Absolutely,
absolute amazing vocal range.
So we're gonna move on and talk about the second track, A New Level. And for myself, the real highlight for me, Vinnie Paul. Not an overly technical drummer, but for me, he just lays down such a great foundation for the rest of the band to carry the song.
Yeah, like for New Level, they start off with the super slow super simple riff. It's just a chromatic piece, and they play it slow, they play it heavy, and it's just every hit that Vinny does on this album, it feels like it's exactly where it should be. It's super precise, and it really just plays into that whole tight rhythm section feel that they have as a band. Like it probably has a lot to do with the fact that Vinny and Dime were brothers, right? So they grew up playing music together, so they knew how each other played, and they just used that to their advantage. But just opening up on such a slow and heavy riff after ending Mouth for War with a fast outro, like I said earlier, when it just feels like all these songs feel like they were kind of written to be played in this order. It works so well. They have like a contrast of a fast end in Mouth for War with a slow beginning for New Level, which eventually kind of goes to, when it goes to the verse, it goes to that mid-tempo pace. Like it's like the head-banging tempo. Pantera sits in that tempo for so much of this album, and it works. They don't have to play fast, but when they do, it feels like it's important. It's like, oh yeah, finally we're getting to something fast, but then it'll go back to like to your heavy groove, going right back to that southern heavy sound where it's about the groove. Even when you look at I think Phil brought a lot of that inspiration in, because he was part of that New Orleans sound, and a lot of those bands, they were really into the Melvins, and the Melvins kind of taught that whole scene that they could slow things down and still be heavy. So even though Pantera does a lot of fast riffing, they can slow it down and it's still really heavy. What do I have on here for my notes? It's funny, I don't have too much to actually note about that song. I do remember at some point there's this video that you could find online, it's probably still out there, where it was like Madonna playing Pantera, and it's like, oh, that can't be real. And then you find out later, oh, it actually was. Yeah, the guy who was playing guitar for the live shows taught her how to play it. Whether or not she played it through an amp and was just miming it or whatever is a different thing, but she was at least looking like she was playing the notes. It's just a chromatic riff. It's so easy. Madonna can do it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I actually do have a few notes here. Of course, Dimebag Darrell, once again, fantastic in this. But I think for me, that little guitar part he does at the beginning, where he gets like little whammy bar squeals or whatever, that's just like, that's really cool. And I can kind of see where like new metal DJs would take weird influences from that in their scratches years later.
It's kind of funny. One of the early bands I was in, I did that exact sound for a guitar intro. It was just maybe not that exact sound, but it was something very similar. And looking back, I think I just straight up ripped it off.
Yeah. And it's funny because even when I was listening to it, the only thing that really comes close to that is those little squeals that Gr8Wyte does.
Oh, I like the pinch harmonics.
Yeah. Now another guy again I want to talk about, Rex Brown, and I thought he sounded fantastic. Listen, and again, it really goes to show how great of a rhythm section Pantera has, where it's just it's not in your face, but it's such a great compliment to the rest of the band.
Yeah. Yeah. Whenever there's guitar, that bass is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And of course, Phil's attack in those vocals. I mean, what can you really say, man? Like, it's such such a consistent theme of this album, that how great it really is.
Yep. Vulgar Display of Power. Every bit of this album lives up to that name for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I said earlier, he's got such a bite to his vocals. Like I'm not much of a lyric guy, so I honestly can't tell you what he says for a lot of the vocals. I'm like being a bass player, I've always been about bass riffs, guitar riffs, and drums because drums are awesome. But yeah, vocals, couldn't tell you what he's saying a lot of the time. Oh yeah, this is the one where he was doing, I think this is the one where he did the salute at a show. So yeah, there is like a lot of you know, the idea of white supremacy that talks white supremacy that gets talked about with this band quite a bit, just mainly because of Phil's antics outside of Pantera. That and the Confederacy flag being such a prominent piece of their imagery. Yeah, so I don't know. Should we even talk about the lyrical aspects of some of this stuff?
You can if you want, but I actually want to move on and talk about the third track. This song right here, just when you talk about the album title, Vulgar Display of Power, this song just solidifies that.
Wow. Yeah.
Easily one of the most recognizable riffs in metal history. It's such a simple yet powerful riff. And honestly, we're talking about, and you're absolutely right, Andrew, when you're talking about how songs feel like they're written to complement each other. This song is such a perfect answer to the sheer power of A New Level. It's a slower song, but it still retains the heaviness.
Yeah. Yeah, and Walk, it never goes past that headbang tempo. It's one of those songs where when you hear it, you know it. It's the most recognizable song out of Pantera's entire discography. Like arguably Cowboys from Hell, the title track, could be a competitor, but I don't think there's any metalhead who wouldn't recognize Walk from a distance, right? Because it's such a memorable guitar riff. It's got those gaps in between the notes too. So it definitely differentiates itself from anything else. And the buildup of the drums and bass at the beginning, where you actually get that clangy bass tone, it's like, I feel like there should have been more of that clang.
And it's funny because I have that in my notes. Rex Brown's bass just fucking roars in this track. And of course he's following Dime's lead. But I actually want to talk a little bit about the mixing, because one thing that we talked about in the break was just the difference between Cowboys and Vulgar, where for me, I thought that Cowboys from Hell, maybe it was a product of the time, but I felt the mixing was a little too high up there, a little too sheer. And I thought they brought that back, had a little bit more of their, not grittiness, but had a little more of a lower end to it, more than a higher end for Vulgar.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair statement. As much as I want to hear more of that bass, it definitely sits where it needs to. The guitar tone on this album is a lot better than Cowboys. It does that solid state sound, but it does it better. And yeah, and like you brought up before, there's so much less reverb on this album too. It feels tight. All the rhythms are tight with the drums, tight with the bass, and they feel like it's a 3-piece rhythm section essentially. Like a lot of people will look at a band and say, yeah, the bass player and the guitar player, or bass player and drummer, are the rhythm section. But in this band, it is a 3-piece rhythm section, and then just having a vocalist on top of it.
Yep. Yeah, because Dime's riffs themselves, I mean, they very much have a very groove orientated rhythm mindset up until the solo, where he just rips into it, right? And I think that's such a great compliment to the rest of the band, because I often think how different of a band Pantera would sound if you had Rex and Vinny being a rhythm section and Dime just goes off and does his own thing.
Yeah, the walk solo is probably my favorite Dimebag solo, mainly because of that two hand slide on the neck. That is like the coolest thing ever. And he does like a cool bluesy solo under it too. Like it's groove all over the place. If there's a way to pinpoint this album, it is groove. Like, oh, they also started the groove metal genre, so I guess that's suiting.
Absolutely. And we always talk again about Phil Anselmo. He absolutely takes control in this song with his vocals. And the one nice thing I really think about Phil is, unlike some singers out there, when they have to go really high end, they really have to like put a vocalist, they seem to really overdo it. Phil, he has his classic roar, but he always teeters on the edge and he doesn't get to a point where he overdoes it.
Yeah, he, like I said, this is like the best sounding he's been on any Pantera album. Like I said, on Trendkill, not my favorite album, and mainly because of the vocals. It's been a long time since I've listened to that album, so maybe that opinion's changed. But like this is his best sound overall for sure. One thing I want to bring up about Walk though, when you look at song structures, I think this is the only one on the album that follows your classic formula. So that's being different to everything else on the album. It definitely stands out, but it does follow that simple verse chorus solo type of mentality. And they play well into it, contrasting with what the rest of the album does.
It does. And of course, when talking about the song Walk itself, you can definitely tell if Pantera gets played on the radio or they're used in other forms, it's always the song. And it's such a simple riff. And you're right, it has that formula, but it's such a simple song that, again, it's a song that multiple bands and multiple artists have covered. And most recently, I believe Avenged Sevenfold did a cover, I think, on one of their live albums at least, which was actually surprisingly not that bad. As much as I'm not the biggest diehard Avenged Sevenfold fan, they didn't do a bad job of it, to be perfectly honest.
I don't know if I've heard that one.
Not bad. Not bad.
What I had another note here. Where was it? No, I think I've covered everything about that song. The outro though, it's probably the simplest part of the song. Like the simple riff, dun da do 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 do. It's that bend. I could see that being really tricky to replicate every time. But not only was Dimebag doing it, but Rex was having to do that as well, right? So having them do that, mimicking that same bend every single time, pretty impressive. I don't know how it sounded live. I don't think I've ever seen a live recording of that. But then you go to the outro, and it's just and I've always loved Vinny's drumming on that, because he just keeps it simple, and then he adds like that one little and goes back to simple. It's one of the best ways they could have ended that song. Like, and I don't think there really is like a proper like end note that you would hit for that. Just a fade out, perfect.
Like how and it's funny because we were talking about how Walk was a perfect answer to A New Level. Track 4, fucking Hostile. Talk about a perfect answer to Walk. I mean, you talk about a song that just turns up the speed, turns up the velocity right to 11, right from the get-go.
Yeah, so we finally get a bit of an answer to that speed from Mouth for War, because every song up to this point has been that mid-tempo headbanging quality, whereas this is your thrash track of the album. Like the chorus, I've always felt has like a punk influence, just because like that's a punk riff in the chorus, and I love it. It works well into Phil's vocal style, because he's got that attack, he's got that grit. So finally going into a more punk, more thrash sound works really well. And then those drum fills in between the chorus and the verses, or the chorus and the guitar solo, they're awesome. Like even having Phil shout out Vince before he does his fill, it's just like everything sounds super tight, super precise. His syllables on Vince don't last any longer than they need to, right? It's I love that song so much.
And it's hilarious because I also have that as in my notes because it's still one of my favorite choruses on the album. But for me, something I thought was really cool, and you already mentioned it, that little drum fill Vinny does to segue back into the verse. So cool. And it's such a subtle touch too that I think a lot of people listen to it like going, oh, that's kind of cool.
And it's super simple. It's like digga 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 da. It's not that difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I think oh, and we can't talk about this song without talking about the mic feedback at the end, like the mic drop. I love that. I've always found that hilarious, but it's so awesome.
You know what's funny? I have this in my notes, and all it says, fill in the final 13 seconds. Fucking hostile. Perfect way to end it. It's true. It's such a perfect way to end the song, too, right? Where you have it. You have him just building up, and he just lets it go right at the end.
Yeah, and then even the rhythm track under solos thing. This is one of the few songs where it feels totally justified to have that rhythm track playing because it's a thrash song, right? How many thrash songs don't have a rhythm guitar under the solo? You gotta have that there. If they had just dropped that, it just, you know, that bass isn't going to give the same attack as like digga 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 digga. It had to be that. And then yeah, just with the contrast between this song and the next one, you have the fastest song on the album going into, I'd say, the slowest song. I think This Love is the slowest song on the album, isn't it?
No, I think the final track on the album is from
Was it Hollow?
I think it's Hollow, yeah. The one thing I don't know how you feel about this. One thing I was kind of cold about on the song itself, Dime's solo. If I'm being perfectly honest, and I think because one guy whose leads I'm not crazy about is Kerry King from Slayer. I'm not crazy about it. It's just way too frantic. It's just like, it doesn't do anything for me. And I think it had a bit of a Kerry King vibe to it, which again, Kerry King was not my favorite lead guitar player in the world. As much as I love the late Jeff Hanneman and Slayer, yeah, Kerry's playing a Slayer just didn't do anything for me for the band.
You know, I'm a big Slayer fan. I love them, but yeah, the guitar solos are definitely the weak spot of that band. Like a lot of people give Kirk Hammett a lot of fuss about using wah in every solo. Kerry King, wah in every solo, but he hits any note. Right? It's like, I don't know. There's not much that's musical about it. It's just more, I can play fast and make noise. But I totally see how that kind of idea does find its way into the solo, except Dimebag actually plays music.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's not the most memorable guitar solo on this album for sure, but it does what it needs to. Yeah. I don't have much to say about it.
It's true. But I think playing solos with a wah-wah pedal is one thing that you're absolutely right. It's one thing if you play it with just anything, but I think you have to find the perfect kind of solo to complement it. I think Kirk Hammett does it going out of the metal scene. I think one guy who doesn't get enough credit is Mike McCready from Pearl Jam. I think when you listen to some of the early solos from Pearl Jam's records, when he uses a wah-wah, I thought complements it well.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Wah pedal can be used really well, really tastefully. Like, you know, it is a bit of a joke that if it's there, a guitar player will use it. Like I'm a bass player and I've always had a wah on my pedal board and I am super guilty. It's like, oh, it's my time to sign. Wacka wacka. It's the easy go-to. It's an easy way to pop through the mix a little more. It's just, it's also just super fun.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but didn't Cliff Burton use those on a couple of Metallica records?
He sure did. And he's one of the main reasons I got into that. Yeah, like Anesthesia Pulling Teeth. That has a fuzzed out wah all over it. For Whom the Bell Tolls, that intro, fuzz wah again. Yeah, a couple of like the biggest Cliff moments or the go-to ones. Yeah, they have wah as like the biggest moment in them. And yeah, wah has just always been like the best effect.
So true. So we're going to move on and talk about the fifth track, This Love. And earlier in the episode, you were talking about how you wish that Rex, especially in Dime solos, were mixed a little bit more higher and to fill in that space. I think for myself, when I listened to the intro with Dime playing that arpeggiated riff, I thought Rex was a little bit distracting on it myself. I wish they had kind of mixed him back a little bit just because it is very, very noticeable. I don't know how you feel, but that's just the way that I'm looking at it right now.
I didn't really notice. For me, I think that's where I wish the bass would sit for a lot of the time. Like a volume perspective. Like maybe it's an EQ thing that could have
Maybe.
changed, but it plays exactly what it needs to for those clean parts. And thinking back to like a live scenario, I don't know how they'd play that live. I don't know if they ever did play it live, but being a one guitar band, they can't just have nothing there. So maybe that was a compromise on it, because Pantera always liked to record what you were going to hear live, and it felt like the band you were seeing live was the band that you were hearing on the album. So maybe that was a compromise where they have a loud bass part for where there's just this clean guitar with a solo on it, and since that bass is definitely going to be there live, they just wanted to accent it.
Yeah. And something I didn't appreciate, and you already mentioned this, something I didn't appreciate till going back to listen to this album from a critical point of view, how many moving parts really were in this song from just the three-piece band?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Just like all the moving parts where you have like, and you said how difficult it would have been to produce live or play it.
Mm.
What I'm looking at from that point of view, where you have just all the parts that have to line up and just have to hit and have to fit, I could kind of understand where it maybe wouldn't translate live, but even maybe it's a different thing in the studio where you can fuck with it all you want in editing. But yeah, for myself, there is, from my point of view, there's just quite a few moving parts here that I agree wouldn't really translate live.
Yeah, like this song in particular, having a clean part with a solo on it. And and like, geez, I don't know how many guitar tracks they did per song with the rhythms. Like if I remember right, on Metallica's Black Album, at any time on that album, I think you're hearing upwards of like 4 or 5 rhythm tracks all happening at the same time. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did something similar with the Pantera albums. It's like at minimum 2, right? Because you're getting a stereo sound. But I have to imagine that there is probably 4 rhythm tracks total per song.
Mm.
Because of how Dime played and he was super tight, that is something that would have translated a little better live. That said, there are songs, I think that's something I even forgot to talk about. Yeah, back in Mouth for War, I have a note here, I totally missed it. One of the riffs, they even add harmonies between the rhythm tracks. It's like it's the held note, and if you hear it in headphones, you can actually hear the left side and the right side are doing different notes, but to make a harmony. They're never going to be able to pull that off live unless there's like some kind of chord that he was able to play that would do the trick. But in a live situation, it's probably one of those things you could get away with and no one would even notice, right?
Yeah. Unless you're doing with backing tracks, maybe. But
yeah, but I don't know. Doesn't seem. I've never been a fan of backing tracks, to be honest. I don't think that would have flown very well. That would also require them playing to a click the whole time just to line it up. And I don't know. I can't see them playing to a click live. They seem more of like a feel type of band.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And the main riff itself, it sounds like something Metallica would have wrote on And Justice for All. And there's nothing bad about that, despite the fact that I think, for myself anyway, of the first 4 Metallica records, And Justice was just my least favorite out of the 4 of them.
Yeah, out of the first 4, yeah, it's the weakest link for sure. Having no Cliff probably was a big factor in that.
Mm-hmm. Or Jason.
Yeah, was Jason on any of the 80s albums? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's debatable for sure.
Yeah. And again, like I said, this is just a recurring trend and a theme. Phil's vocals. But what really would, as much as I talk about how his loud vocals are great, his vocals when he goes quiet is just, you don't think Phil has that in his arsenal when it comes to his vocal delivery.
Yeah, because we're still talking about This Love, right?
Yes.
yeah, like this is one of the few times on this album where he actually sings clean.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. So let's move on to track 6, Rise. And
there's one thing I want to bring up on This Love first. That super heavy breakdown that they have in it. That's one of those moments where they really show that they can play loud, but they know how to slow it down and stay slow. Like they don't speed up. Maybe live that was different, but in this, it just feels like so much control, because naturally people will want to play faster, but they just stay slow. They keep it slow. And the outro on this, they have that breakdown just fade out, but then a fade in happens with the clean intro with like this like really reverb heavy guitar solo on it. And then now we can segue to the next song. We got another one. Yes, Rise. We got Rise, and it's got another one of those contrast moments. You ended This Love with a nice clean ending, and then Rise in your face. It's another great transition.
Yeah, but it's funny, for as group oriented the album really has been thus far, this track is very thrashy, and you could tell how much thrash metal was, or how much Pantera was very influenced by thrash metal. And Dime's solo, total thrash metal vibes. Like it gave me, I could see somebody like a Kirk Hammett or even a Marty Friedman from Metallica pulling something like this off.
Marty Friedman from Metallica,
or sorry, Megadeth. Sorry,
I was like, I think I missed a decade. He's another guy who wasn't on And Justice for All, was he?
No, that's on me. That's on me.
Speaking of bad details, I'm just gonna bring up the mix-up I had earlier. Yep. When I was like, yeah, that song that I heard Pantera, the first song I heard from Pantera, I can't even name the album correctly, and I should have known it. I said it was on Reinventing the Steel. That's totally wrong. It was Becoming off of Far Beyond Driven. I should have known that. I'm the worst Pantera fan.
And we've already established that no, you're not. Yeah, there's just
shucks.
For me, there's just, I don't know, there's just not really much to talk about with Rise. It just kind of is what it is. It's a thrash metal track that done by Pantera.
Yeah, it's thrash. It does another contrast with, you know, a fast pre-chorus and slows down with that chorus. Dun 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 dun. Like, yeah, it's super catchy. Oh, I've got a note here about this solo end has whammy bar, and I think it's a harmony thing. So I feel like that whammy section was like multi-tracked with different notes, or it's some kind of warble effect. I'm not too sure. I don't know much about that side of guitar effects, unfortunately, but I remember that's like one of the standout moments for me. It's another one of those solos where there's no guitar rhythm track under it. It's just super groovy rhythm section with a sweet solo on it. And it almost feels like it's sitting in the background. Like it just feels a little different than the rest of the solos, but then it has those accents ba-dum, bam, bam, ba-dum, bam, in between that really splits the solo up a bit. But yeah, that whammy bar piece at the very end of the solo, my favorite part of that whole song for sure.
One thing, and I actually didn't put this in my notes, was I believe it was in the chorus when Phil goes, "It's time to rise." When he does that, when he raises his vocals, I'm like, doesn't really add much, but it's kind of a really cool touch though.
Oh, actually, I do have another note here. If you split the verse track into revolutions, it's like the first two revolutions and the fourth revolution play on the downbeat, but the third revolution of the guitar riff, it's like it's on the offbeat, and Phil's vocals accent that, and they just have a cool play with it. Yeah, that's all I've got on that song.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I think is really becoming a trend for me when we get into the second half is just when I'm talking about the album as a whole. I mean, as strong as the first half is, I don't know. Second half isn't as strong for me. It has some moments, but it's still pretty good. So we're gonna move on to track 7, No Good, Attack the Radical. I absolutely love how tight that opening is for the first 25 seconds is. The riff used in the chorus, to me, doesn't get enough love.
Yeah, this is another one of those kind of iffy lyrical songs as well. I like, this is one where it was like there were certain words popping up to me, because like I honestly, when I listen to music, I honestly can't tell what a lot of the lyrics are to most songs, but there's a couple lyrics where I'm like, oh boy, is this one of those aged poorly songs? So I looked it up, and there's a lot of people who debate about what the song's actually about. um yeah, and I don't know, I don't really have much to say on that. It seemed to be like a very convoluted subject on it. um yeah, because you keep hearing the songs or the words like pride and racism, and yeah, I don't know exactly what Phil was going for when he wrote it.
Yeah.
Now I do have a note here: the bass groove doesn't have the greatest bass tone, and like during those opening sections where it's like, quiet and subdued, and Phil is kind of doing like a spoken, almost like a rap, not rap, but like
Spoken word.
he's like very rhythmic with his pronunciation. The bass under it, it's like it loses most of its tone. It's like more of like a clickety click click click, almost like maybe that's where Korn got a little bit of influence, right? But yeah, it's like I feel like they could have gone a little bit something a little different with that bass tone, just to make it better. Now I will say, yeah, there's vocal harmonies in the chorus that I thought were pretty rad. Over this album, I don't think you really hear too much in the way of like vocal harmonies, but this is just one that stuck out for me. And funny enough, I actually wrote on here for me, this was the weakest track on the album up to this point for me. It's funny because you even said like it was your favorite of the album up to this point.
I was gonna say I really like how tight the opening is. I think for myself, we're still a couple of tracks away from being my least favorite on the record, but I do agree with your Korn point there, and you can tell the influence this had on bands. I most notably a band like Cold Chamber with that jun 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 jun, that chunky kind of riff that they were playing really gave me vibes of the song "Loco" they had from the late '90s. Dime's part at 252, and again, I'm going back to his whammy bar squeals because again, I totally see where rap, rock, new metal DJs got influences of how they can incorporate their sound into the music.
You know what? I could totally see that too. And I wouldn't be surprised if Dime's playing even influence like Tom Morello. Like Tom Morello, he doesn't really play so much like note guitar solos. He plays like cool sounding pieces.
Yeah.
More focused on effects. And Dime does a lot of that on this album. He kind of uses those big like whammy squeals to like to split up the solo into parts. So it's like maybe he'll start off with that squeal, he'll go into a solo, and then he'll return to like some other sound effect. It's just like another one of those pieces he has in his arsenal. And yeah, another thing that a lot of people just latched onto.
100%, man. 100%. So we're going to move on to the 8th track, Live It a Hole. This is a track I don't have much really to say about it. I mean, the riff, I don't know how you feel, but the main riff itself, it's not really much to write home about. The only thing I could really talk about, I thought Dime's solo was kind of cool, and Rex's bass kind of really complimented it for me.
I love the intro on this, just because it starts with the regular guitar, then it switches to like the wah version of the riff, followed by a solo. So it's like, to me, that's the hook into this song. And once the solo ends, I believe they go into like a talk box effect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's got to be a talk box. And I had no idea it was for the longest time. But then I just listened to it this last time, and I'm like, you know what? That actually sounds like it's a vocal under that effect. That's got to be a talk box. Oh, that's so cool. Like when I think like talk box, I think of like Aerosmith, not Pantera.
Yeah.
And then and then they go into their slinky southern groove that shows for that main verse riff. And then I don't know, most of this track doesn't really stand out too much for me, but I always think of like that verse riff for sure. Oh, and the shifting grooves in the guitar solo. Like I think it stays the same tempo, but it's just the beat that Vinny decides to play under it. He just shifts the mood a little bit. Yeah, and he just being able to play as a rhythm section just makes that section that little bit cooler.
So I'm going to move on to the 9th track here. Regular People, Conceit. Gee, can't tell where Coal Chamber was influenced by this at all. God, even listening to this last night, I was just like, yeah. Can't tell where they got the influence for Loco, could you?
The first note I have on this is groove, groove, groove.
Yep.
That intro riff, it's so tight and it's so groovy. It's so fun. And like just the way the drums mix up with the rhythm guitar and bass for the end of that riff, just nail it down. And going into that verse, dun 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 dun. Oh, it's one of those great heavy moments again.
Oh, it's so good. But for me, one thing that we really haven't talked much about, Vinnie Paul's double kicks, because it doesn't really come out much in this album, but it's really, really nice when it does. And yeah, I just thought it worked really well for this song.
Yeah, and it's one of those different aspects that they bring to it. They don't really have a feel like that on the rest of this album. Like they've got like thrash moments, but they don't have like a just a steady kick section like this. And it just plays really well having the drums going like full kick, and then the guitar and bass playing like this this tight riff on top of it with gaps in between, but the drums still go on top, or the drums still go underneath. That just sounds so cool. It's like I feel like every song in this album could kind of be like that skit with Chris Farley, where he's like, "Hey, do you remember when you made the White Album?" Yeah, I remember that. That was so cool. That was awesome. It's like that's most of this album. So yeah, like Regular People. Do you remember listening to that song? Yeah, that was awesome.
It's true. It really, really does. And you know, Farley was so great at that too. But yeah, I totally agree. That's just the vibe that we're getting off this. Now, track 10 doesn't really give me that vibe though. By Tiemens, Be Driven. Just I don't know, this is my least favorite track on the album. There's nothing really specifically wrong for me. It's just I don't know, there's just something about it that just doesn't resonate for me on the rest of the album.
Having that isolated guitar part at the very beginning, it's one of like the one of the best ways you can hear just how tight Diamond Daryl, what are we calling him? Diamond, well, just whatever, just to show how tight his rhythm playing was. Digga 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 da, right? He's doing a multi-track for that, and they all sound like they're just perfect together.
It's true, because and the funny thing is nowadays with say Pro Tools and Pro Logic and all that stuff, you could digitally alter that. You can have the one track and just double it all you fucking want. But 1992, if you wanted that, you had to do it individually.
Yeah, nowadays, if you have a one take that was a little bit out, you can always tweak it. And yeah, I'm not guilty of that at all.
So we're going to move on to the 11th and final track of the album, Hollow. And this is kind of a cool song because it has a bit of obviously being from the South, it has a real Leonard Skinner vibe to it. It kind of sounds like something that would have been like, say, Tuesday's Gone. Not so much Freebird. I would say Tuesday's Gone, but for myself, I liked it. It's not a bad closer, to be honest with you.
It's not a bad song at all. I always felt like it's a weird way to end this album, because when you go to the last album or the last song on an album, you tend to think it's going to be like the standout track of the album. Like I know for me, like whenever I listen to, like, we'll bring up Metallica for the umpteenth time. Like when you look at like Master of Puppets, it ends with Damage Incorporated, and then you get like And Justice for All, which ends with Dyer's Eve. Like they're the fastest songs on those albums, and like Metallica kind of like perfected the way to structure an album at that time. And then this album comes along and they don't follow that structure at all. They just did what they wanted to do, and then they end it with like almost like the softest song on the album. Like This Love, it's like competing for that softest song on the album spot, but I think Hollow is just softer the entire time, except for, you know, the heavier chorus sections. And am I thinking of the right song now? Yeah, and it does go heavy towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just overall, it's the clean song on the album with some really cool guitar solos on top of those clean sections.
Well, it's funny thinking about this song for me, and I keep bringing up Phil Anselmo's vocals. But for me on this, it's Phil who really gets me, because you genuinely see some real genuine emotion behind it. Not so much from when he's genuine anger and he's screaming, but he just has this way of singing where it's just like, whoa, okay. I know that we've listened to this entire album for 50 plus minutes and you've just yelled and screamed at me the entire time. And now you're here doing more of a softer kind of, not vulnerable, but he has that kind of vocal delivery that is just perfect for the track.
It's the melancholy song of the album.
Yeah. Now, talking about the song itself, and of course, Far Beyond Driven closed out the same way with Planet Caravan too, where it had that kind of slower, not so much softer, but slower tune. And I was kind of debating which one of the tracks really did it better, to be perfectly honest, because I don't mind Planet Caravan. It's not my favorite track off of Far Beyond Driven, but I think it's not a bad way to close out the album.
The thing is, whenever I've listened to Far Beyond Driven, I've never really thought of Planet Caravan being the actual end of the album. I've always thought of that as like a bonus track because it's a Sabbath cover, right? Mm-hmm. So like, I don't know. I've never really thought about it as part of the album. But like that, for them to do a cover of that on a super heavy album, I always thought was so smart. Like when they go and tell people, yeah, we covered Sabbath on our new album, people are like, oh, what'd you play? Like Children of the Grave, or like, you know, like any like heavier song. They're like, no, we covered Planet Caravan. What? Just the shock value of it, I thought was so great.
Well, do you remember that tribute album bands did for Black Sabbath covers? I think it came out in the late 90s, early 2000s. It had like, I think Primus covered NIB, and who the hell did Iron Man? I think it was like, not Black Label Society, but it was somebody who they did, was like a whole cover album.
I remember this. It's
I'm gonna look.
I can't remember what it's. I'm looking it up too.
Yeah, because I can't think of it right now too. It's such a really, it was kind of a neat idea because you don't see this very often, right?
Nativity in Black, a tribute to Black Sabbath. Is that the one?
That's the one.
Who do we got on this? Biohazard, White Zombie, Megadeth. Huh. Yeah, Corrosion Conformity is on there. Bruce Dickinson.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that fly around so much when that came out, but I don't think I've ever checked it out.
Snowblind, I remember that. That was kind of cool. Pantera was on it. They did Electric Funeral.
I'm not seeing all the songs. Oh, there we go. Now they're all there.
Monster Magnet did Into the Void. That was not bad, actually.
Oh, that's so cool. Hole in the Sky, done by Machine Head. And
well,
then, you know.
Well, I know what you're going to be listening to later on.
Oh, it's definitely going to be Busta Rhymes' version of Iron Man.
God, that's such a weird combination, right?
Right? But it came out in that time, right?
Yeah. I'm just kind of surprised Rage Against the Machine wasn't a part of that, because they had a really big influence at the time.
Oh, I'd love to hear them do a Sabbath cover. That'd be rad.
Yeah, because they did, who the hell did they do? Renegades of Funk. I know they covered that song. They did a couple of covers off their final album, but I think, no, what would they cover though? That's what I want to know.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool though. I've never looked at that. I'll have to check that out sometime.
Yeah. Now, the final note I have on Hollow and the album as a whole, I felt that the heavy riff at 307, I think the music should have gone really quiet first before it hit, just because it just kept going and then it hit and it's like, oh, okay, are we doing this now? There should have been either a segue, or the music should have like been faded down and then it hit, I think it would have had a better impact for myself.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, like as great as I keep saying this album is, I will say like I never really think of this song. Like this is the one that comes to mind the least. But so they did the smart thing when they were planning out this album, like Mouth for War, New Level, Walk. Like every song plays really well in each other, and they're all really memorable. But then yeah, it kind of does hit a point where you're not really remembering them. I'm not great with song titles, so a lot of them I kept going like, what's the name of that one? Yeah, I don't remember. Like, um, and to end on like such a weird fade out like that, I don't know. It's a weird way to end the album. But if you listen to it on a CD on loop, having it go back into Mouth for War is another one of those great transitions, whether or not it was intentional or not. So yeah, it's one of those albums you could play on loop and never know it.
Absolutely, man. Well, Andrew, I guess that wraps up our track by track review of Vulgar Display of Power by Pantera. So I really, again, I can't thank you enough for doing this album, man. I really appreciate that. Now, before we get off into the close, is there any final album or any final thoughts you want to give on the album before we head off into the close?
I'm really glad you asked me to do this because, like I said, like this is an album that I haven't listened to thoroughly for a long time. So it was really fun to go back and listen to all these and just be really analytical of them this time instead of just going in and being like, yeah, this is a good time. I'm digging it. Now I'm just like, what are the things I like and don't like about it? And there's a lot of things I really like about it. And there's a couple of things that dropped the ball for me, mainly like bass EQing and such. Like a couple small tweaks here and there would be nice. Like maybe that's something that they could do on like future releases. I don't know what status
I think they did
Pantera catalog is really in.
I'll have a look on Spotify. I think they did a 20th anniversary for the album, but
I don't think it was a remix. It was probably just a remaster.
Yeah.
So it's like what's there is there.
Power extended. Yeah. Okay. It was just a remaster of the album.
Okay. Yeah. So I think at best they're just gonna tweak a couple things and I don't know.
Yeah.
I really do enjoy that the photo quality of the remaster is not as good as the original. Like it has like one of those like scanner lines on it.
Yeah. Just like a segueing here into video games. It's kind of like, when Grand Theft Auto, when they put out Vice City and San Andreas on the new consoles, they had like a remaster.
Oh, like the high def deluxe definitive edition, longest title ever. Yeah.
And it looks no better than what it did on a tablet.
You know why? Because they're the mobile versions of those games. That was the worst.
Oh, it was. I guess my final thought on the album itself is that I think as an album, I think it's very much worthy of the praise of it gets. But I think for myself, looking at it from a critical standpoint, I do agree with you. I think once it hits the midpoint, it's just, there's not really much that's really memorable about it. There's certain moments that you're like, oh, that's kind of cool. That's kind of neat. But as a whole, it's just like, I think that has more to say about how strong the first half of that album really was, where you had Mouth for War, Walk, A New Level, fucking Hostile, stuff like that.
Yeah. And like we were talking about transitions, every single song on this album transitions into the next track perfectly. Like they don't run into each other, but it's just as one's ending, it ends a certain way. And then the next track is going to be something that either plays into it or is completely different. It doesn't just sound monotonous. Every song start sounds intentional, and they're all memorable starts. Whether or not the rest of the song is like flawless is a different thing, but they all start out with that awesome hook. What was it? I had another point about the whole album. Oh boy. Yeah, like the guitar solos, there were a lot of like, I have a note on here about experimental guitar effects for solos. And like it's something that he was doing previously, but on this album I really feel like is when they started to happen. And like I brought up with like the reverbed whammy harmony piece. Like it's a 1 second part at the end of a solo, but it's, to me, it's like the coolest idea. And it's never elaborated on again the same way. It's just they experimented with something and it's something unique to that song. Just something that they do so well on this. Yeah, it's a fantastic album from front to back, but I will say, yeah, it does kind of lose that something in the second half. But how do you top the first half of the album?
Right? Well, guys, that wraps up this episode of the Gr8Wyte Experience. Just a reminder, you can find the show on Twitter at Gr8Wyte as well as myself at Gr8Wyte and you can find the show on YouTube and Spotify. For this episode, I am your host, Taylor Gibson, and I'll see you next time. Okay, Andrew, so I know that we just finished off talking about the album. We just did the close, but there's one final thing and we were talking about this, I think you wanted to bring up for the episode.
Yeah, and that was like the long-standing effect of the guitar sound on the album. Not just the guitars, but even the drums too. Because when you listen to Cowboys, a lot of that stuff. Oh, you disappeared there. There we go. A lot of that stuff there had a lot of reverb. We might have brought that up, but on this album they brought in like tight kick sound, tight guitar sound, and everything. Like tight is the key word to that album. And going on, so many bands after that would emulate that sound. And like we were talking about just before we started recording again, when you asked me to review this, I was like, why are we reviewing this? I don't know. What's the occasion for it? And then I'm like, oh my God, it's like 30 years old. Oh boy. And in my head, I always associate Pantera as late 90s, not early 90s. Like this is a year after the Black Album, and it's just they're two totally different sounding albums, and they both were so influential in their own ways. But with the Vulgar sound, like when you listen to it, you can hear that same attack in so many modern metal productions.
It's true. I mean, and it's funny because we were talking about this, and it's an album that it doesn't sound dated. It doesn't sound a part of its time, where a lot of the rock and metal stuff at the time, like if you go back and listen to like say glam metal or whatever, you can be like, oh yeah, that was done in the 80s, or this was done in the late 80s, or this was done whenever. This album, if you just gave me the album, okay, what year did this come out, without any idea about the album or the band itself, I probably would have never been able to tell you, because it does not sound its age.
Yeah, production wise, it is aged so much better than most of the albums coming out around that time. Yeah, just spectacular production on it.
Yeah, well, even albums coming out nowadays that have a very digital sound to it, I think 10 years down the road, it probably will sound just very synthetic, very dated, very of its time, kind of like what rap, rock, and new metal was in the early 2000s.
Yeah, like right now the big name of the game is like compression and fake drums galore. So yeah, I think that's something that's probably not going to age the greatest. But yeah, going back to that album, yeah, it stands the test of time for sure.